1 in 100 chance of getting your actors to do it right on the right day.
Well, they can charge a fortune for it now. It works. It's 8 minutes past 7 in Beijing. 8 minutes past 6, actually, in Beijing. 22:08 here in London, and you're listening to the Monocle Daily.
From London
to New York
to Tokyo
to Shanghai
to Berlin
to Tel Aviv
to Buenos Aires
to Toronto
to Amsterdam.
All around the world, this is Monocle 24.
You're listening to The Daily on Monocle 24 with me, Andrew Muller and Emma Nelson. Today is, give or take, the second anniversary of the beginning of what has escalated into the Syrian civil war. In those 2 years, according to the best guesses of despairing NGOs, some 70,000 Syrians have died, 200,000 more gone missing or been detained, 1 million fled the country, and another 1 million or so internally displaced. And with all due respect to the folly of predicting the Middle East, no end appears to be in sight.
As the Arab Spring swiftly booted out the dictatorships of Mubarak in Egypt, Ben Ali in Tunisia and Gaddafi in Libya, few would have imagined Bashar al-Assad would still be in control 2 years on. So what if he's still there 2 or 5 or 10 years from now? And what, if anything, should the rest of the world be doing about this? Joining us now is the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani and also Fawaz Gerges, Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics. Warm welcome to you both. Let's begin with you first, Nabila. Are you as surprised as everybody else is that Assad is still in power?
No, not really. And in fact, I have been saying all along that Syria was a completely different case from what we saw happening in Libya, for example, for the very simple reason that Syria has a very efficient army, one that has been involved in regional conflict, that has fought against neighboring countries, involved in conflict in Israel, for example, or neighboring Lebanon. So, and the security forces surrounding Assad have proved to be much more loyal than in the case of Libya, for example. So there is no surprise in seeing a never-ending conflict, especially if you add to the fact that Syria has the backup of very powerful countries, including Russia, China, and indeed Iran.
Fawaz Gerges, Nabila Ramdani there says that she is not surprised that Assad is still in power. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Syria was and is a very difficult country to unpack, to make sense of. This is one of the most closed societies in the Middle East. And actually, I was surprised by the intensity and the widespread popular mobilization against Assad. It spread so widely, it encompassed a large group of people. The first few weeks, he really seemed to be losing momentum. But the reality is we still don't know what's happening within the inner circle of the Syrian regime. We could wake up tomorrow and find the regime gone. And, well, we could still next year we might be talking about the end of his presidential term, 2014. The reality is the reason why the dominant narrative in the West has proved to be wrong, because I think it was based mainly on normative, wishful thinking, on speculation, not really on any major facts. What really amazes me and what I find most difficult about Syria is the lack of information, the lack of facts, the lack of concrete details. I mean, think about it. The last 2 years, most of our information comes mainly from the opposition. The opposition narrative has been dominant and accepted by all of us. And deep down, we would like the opposition to be correct and to be right. And I think, and I'm just trying to say, we need to show a bit of humility, intellectual and empirical humility, because we don't know. There's so much about Syria that, to many of us, we feel that we are in the dark.
Fawaz, I just want to stay with you for one follow-up question to that. You're quite right in suggesting that the opposition narrative, incoherent and unfocused though it is, has become the dominant one at the expense of, I guess, the pro-Assad side. Who are Assad's people, though? He presumably does still have support, and are they active supporters, or do they just fear the alternative?
You know, Andrew, if there is really one particular driver, if there is one, if we were to isolate one driver that really helps us to understand why Assad has survived as long as he has, is that he maintains a critical segment of public support inside Syria. His social base, give and take, between 20 and 35%. Well, this is a huge component, basically, of Syrians. And this particular base is willing to basically fight tooth and nail for Assad, and it has been fighting tooth and nail for Assad. And this particular social base, power base, basically represents the backbone of the security and military forces that have been fighting for Assad in the last 2 years and will most likely fight for him till the last day. Neither in Tunisia nor in Egypt did either of the two regimes really had this critical base of support. Yes, regional support is important. Yes, the Russian position is important. But if Assad has not been able to mobilize this critical base of support, he would have gone similarly to Ben Ali in Algeria and Mubarak in Egypt and Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen and others.
Nabila, let me ask you now about the EU's rejection of France's request to lift the arms embargo, namely to supply arms to the rebels. What does this say about the attitude of the rest of the world, given what Fawaz has just said, that Assad still does enjoy quite strong support, even though it is much reduced?
Well, the British position and indeed the French position are now determined effectively to adopt a tactical shift in the handling of the conflict in Syria, and these two countries are ready to bypass the EU arms embargo if indeed member states refuse to lift the measure in May, in coming weeks. And that testifies to the fact that the two countries are increasingly involved in the Syrian conflict. I think Britain in particular has made it clear that it has not ruled out the option of arming the Syrian rebels. Crucially, British intelligence teams and special forces have been in Jordan for over a year now, and they have been giving Syrian rebels military training, but also logistical and security advice. And what British officials argue is that the training of Syrian forces is crucial to fill the security vacuum as and when the Assad regime collapses. And that was very much the background of the royal visit in Jordan a few days ago, when Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall visited the refugee camp, Syrian refugee camp in Jordan. That was also in the context of strengthening the relationship and indeed boosting the cooperation Britain and indeed Jordan. But Britain is also is exploring the military route to sort out this conflict, but at the same time it hasn't given up on the political solution, hence the meeting between William Hague and his Russian counterpart Lavrov a couple of days ago in London.
Nabila, you're quite right to point out that there are, of course, Western special forces already involved to a limited extent, and there have been, probably pretty much since about day 2 of this whole thing. But do you think there are still, or is there any indication that there are limits beyond which Assad cannot go for fear of prompting a more major intervention on the lines of what we saw in Libya or Kosovo?
Well, I think the human limit has been, we've gone well beyond, the level of acceptance. The onslaught on Syrian people, it seems to be never-ending. It's an absolute tragedy. And I think what Western governments are increasingly committed to is that not to allow Syria to be one of those forgotten horrors. And hence, countries like Britain and France pushing for more firm action. But it comes in the context of our societies in the West reflecting on our legacy in Iraq, for example, or in Afghanistan. but also more recently reflecting on our legacy in our involvement in Libya. Certainly, people in France and Britain are already opposing the governments, saying that arming the rebels would certainly be a breach to international law. And it's again, as in Libya, Syria, Iraq or Afghanistan, it's easier to get in than to get out. And I think one of the main things that Western governments have to bear in mind is to consider who's going to get hold of the weapons. There's a very nasty extremist element fighting in Syria, for example, an al-Qaeda-inspired group, the Al-Nusra Front, who has been found guilty of breaches of human rights and indeed human rights abuses already. And crucially, I think one of the things that Western governments have to bear in mind is, are they going to leave Syria in a better state? That's one important component that they have to bear in mind.